Good evening, everyone. My name is Thane Rosenbaum. I'm the creative director of the Forum on Life, Culture, and Society at Touro College. And welcome to the Folks Film Series. Tonight's discussion is on the film Recount, which many of you have seen over the last week since we announced it. It is a film that, yes, recounts the disputed presidential election of 2000 and the infamous Supreme Court decision Bush v. Gore that arose from that disputed election. Our guests tonight are a legendary attorney, David Boies, who you may remember, argued the case on behalf of the Gore campaign team, including the Supreme Court argument, and one of our favorite actors here at Folks, Ed Begley Jr., who actually plays David Boies in the film, as you'll notice. They're twins. See, everyone? There they are. It was perfect casting, right out of central casting, Ed and David.
I wish I looked that good, but I'll accept what you're saying.
We've had a really long history with this film. It's been 20 years, but we in 2008, when the film came out, David will remember, Ed might not, we folks premiered the film and did a discussion at the HBO theater. David was invited. He unfortunately couldn't make it. He had other conflict. But we had at that event, Ron Klain, who you may remember is portrayed by Kevin Spacey in the film, and Ben Ginsberg, a lawyer for the Republican legal team, who was played by Bob Balaban in the film. And here we are 12 years later doing another recount, this time with David Boies and Ed Begley Jr. The film has a lot of sort of 6 degrees of separation for us. Ron Klain has been a guest of Folks a number of times, including that time. Bob Balaban himself has been a guest of Folks. Laura Dern, who won an Emmy for this film, playing the Florida Secretary of State, Catherine Harris. And yes, even Jeb Bush has been a guest at Folks. And he has a very small part as George W. Bush's younger brother, who happens to be the governor of the state that is in dispute. And yes, there's even more Begley and Boies connections for Folks. First, for those of you who've been watching our new series over the pandemic, Conversations in Essential Cinema, you may recall that we showed earlier with Matthew Modine discussing the classic film 12 Angry Men. Well, you might know there's a reason for Ed Begley Jr. Ed Begley Sr. played juror number 10. And this is his proud son, Ed. How proud are you, Ed? There's actually something in the room behind you that you can show us.
Right back there, if you can see it, there's an Oscar. It's not mine. I've never won an Oscar or been nominated, but my father was a wonderful actor, very talented and versatile actor. He was in 12 Angry Men. He was also in Sweet Bird of Youth, and he won that Oscar for Sweet Bird of Youth you see there. And my father left it to me in his will, and I'm very proud, and I display it and remember him. He was a terrific dad. He was a Republican. I'm not, but he was a good man and taught me everything. I'm known for my environmental activities more than my acting, perhaps. And all the stuff I learned about the environment, I learned from my father, because he was a man who lived through the Great Depression. He was the son of Irish immigrants, and we turned off the lights and turned off the water and saved string and saved tinfoil. So my dad was an inspiration to me as an actor and much more.
I love that anecdote, Ed. Ed, since I know he was so proud of you as an actor, I'm going to make a request, because it's just a classic Folks moment. Can you do the iconic scene for juror number 10?
Come on, you know what these people are like. What's the matter? Why nobody looking at me? Come on. I don't remember the dialogue precisely, but that's kind of the moment. He was very good. He had a cold throat. Yeah, he had that voice that terrified me as a young man, but he sure used it to great effect as an actor.
Well, the key to that scene, and then we got to move on because I just love that scene so much, Ed, is his face when they turn their back and he realizes that what he's telling them is not registering with them. And that his face, the face of utter panic, that he's subject to moral banishment, right? That he's being ostracized. It's
for some reason for a reason he doesn't yet understand, it's somehow repugnant to them, and he's losing them in a big way. He's losing the room, and he's not sure why, and then perhaps the penny drops.
And David Boyes, earlier this summer, we did the Netflix film Filthy Rich, the story of
Yes.
Jeffrey Epstein case. And many of you may or may not know, but David Boyes has represented a number of Epstein's victims, and one of his partners, Macaulay, right? I forgot her first name, but she was
Sigrid McCall.
Of course, Sigrid Macaulay, lovely lawyer, was with us that night. So the Boyes law firm was already represented over the pandemic on Folks. So let's start, gentlemen. There's so much to talk about. Let's just talk about the dates. It's extraordinary. It's literally 20 years ago, this coming Tuesday, 20 years ago, that the Supreme Court of Florida ruled to extend the recount and mandated for a statewide recount. Right. And it was on December 12th, I think on the 11th, David Boyes argued on behalf of Al Gore's team before the Supreme Court. And the very next day, they ordered to stop the recount, and that would have been on December 12th. And one of the reasons, and we'll talk about some of the others, one of the reasons is they were the Supreme Court said that the date is so late that the recount would not happen before the safe harbor date, which was also September 12th. And the safe harbor date, that word should mean something to us today, because that's December 8th. That's in 2 days from today, is the safe harbor date. And that's the date that all states are essentially required to certify their election results. So the Supreme Court of the United States said, hey, you ran out of time. We don't want to violate Florida law. Florida law feels that they want to receive the benefits of handing out their electoral delegates on the safe harbor date. So this is really a 20-year anniversary in every way possible. So let me just start off with David and Ed, just to ask, how accurate is the film? So many, our audience watched it over the last week. How accurate was it? And Ed, after David explains that, maybe you can explain how important was it for you to be accurate? Were you in touch with David while you were doing the part?
Mm-hmm.
I had the pleasure of meeting David. David, go first, and then I'll...
No, you go ahead. You ahead.
I just want to say I had the pleasure of meeting him beforehand at a social event in New York, and I told him I was so honored to play him. So hopefully we got it right, but I want to hear firsthand what we got right and perhaps what we didn't.
Well, let me just start off. Were you eating ice cream when you got the call?
I was eating ice cream when I got the call. That part of it was accurate. What was not accurate is in the film I dropped some of the ice cream, and I never dropped ice cream. So that part of it was.
Well, it might have been me fumbling and they left it in. I'm not sure about that.
So the constitutional lawyer in you, David, knowing that was an infamous case, that yet another reason why David Boyes entered legal history was his, oral argument in front of the Supreme Court of the United States. Given the fact that you're a constitutional lawyer, how important would it have been for you that the film got it right, factually, accurately?
I think that, like films generally, what's important is that it captures the truth. It captures the essence of what was happening. And the individual facts on the periphery are often not exactly accurate, because what you have to do is you have to compress 33, 34 days, in a few hours. So I think that the film accurately captured the essence of what was happening, the nature of the controversy, the nature of what was going on. It didn't go into all of the details. It couldn't. And I think some of the details on the periphery of it are brought together in ways that are a composite. I think some of the characters there are really composite characters. But I think it really captured the nature of what was going on and the nature of what ultimately happened there.
I know one person who was very unhappy with the portrayal was Warren Christopher. Warren Christopher was really upset because he said, I never said that I would think this could be resolved by way of compromise and diplomacy. Of course, I knew there was going to be a lawsuit. And apparently I read somewhere that James Baker said, Yeah, it's probably true. He's not that big of a wuss.
Well, I think two people who were unhappy with it were um, Warren Christopher and my good friend Ted Olson. You know,
Yeah.
uh,
Tell me why Ted, first of all, he's not portrayed with the degree of gravitas as David Boies was. And I know that you guys are serious buddies.
yeah,
You argued a case recently before the Supreme Court with
yes.
same-sex marriage. So I know that I don't know if there was a rapprochement at the time.
No,
But
we were friendly at the time.
why is he not really in the movie?
No, well, yeah, I think his unhappiness was not with his not being in the movie. His unhappiness was that the movie sort of portrayed the Republicans as being sort of much tougher than the Democrats, and he thought the Democrats were meaner than he was.
Ed, when the movie was being shot, it was from in 2007, comes out in 2008. It's just to get perspective. The movie, oddly enough, comes out 8 years after this, after the election itself. And it comes out not long before President Obama becomes president of the United States. And I'm wondering, as an actor who was depicting a historical event, do you think that it had a similar resonance, that it came out 8 years later, that people could digest it in a different way? At that point, 2 Bush terms, George W. Bush terms, were coming to an end. And this is a movie of how it started. I wonder whether the filmmakers thought about that gives people an 8-year perspective of why we spent the last 8 years the way we did.
Yeah, Danny Strong worked on the script for quite a while, and so it was ready when it was, I suppose, in 2007 when we shot it. And I, at the time, went in for a meeting with Danny Strong, the writer, and with Jay Roach, the director, and thought, I don't know why they're thinking of me for David Boies. I don't look anything like him. And I saw they had taken an 8x10 of me, an actor's 8x10 picture, and they had taken magic marker and darkened up my hair. And in that picture, I look exactly like him suddenly. By just that one little change. I had no idea I looked that much like the very handsome David Boies. And so I was on board right away and hoped that they got it all right, and they tried to the best of their abilities. David said it very well. You know, you have to sometimes compress things to get it into a 2-hour period, so liberties are taken, and they try to get it as accurate as possible. And for the most part, we did, and I was very proud of it when I saw it and really liked it. And I think it's an important part of our history. And keep in mind, these votes were like, I think, 500 some odd votes apart when they tallied everything properly between Al Gore and George W. Bush. So that's a pretty close election within 500 some odd votes. So it was worthy of that kind of scrutiny. But I also remember very vividly at some point, Al Gore, who was before, when he was a senator and then vice president, and remains to this day, my dear friend, he, for the good of the country, said, we have to move on. And he, I believe, cast a deciding vote in the Senate as well to that effect, and said, we have to move on. We're not going to belabor this, and for the country to heal and what have you. He in essence, conceded. And so, and that was, I think that was very important that very mature that he did that, when it's within 500 some odd votes. There's many other people I can think of that certainly wouldn't do that.
David, given the fact that Ed just explained, Gore's response at the very end, can you explain, this is something I would have asked you later, but Ed gave us such a nice lead in. Technically, the Supreme Court didn't dismiss the case. It told Florida to end the recount, but there was a remand, right? So somebody must have said to David Boies, you know what, let's just not go back to the Florida Supreme Court. Let's just let it go, right? I'm just curious, did you, given the fact that you're David Boies, say, look, this thing is not over. I'm going back to the Florida. I'm going to get them to essentially what they could have essentially ruled is that the safe harbor date is not such a big deal after all, right? That could have been, I suspect, one of the things you could have argued. It's up to them to decide. The Supreme Court said it was really important to Florida, and Florida said, nah, we could wait. What actually happened there?
I think that what happened we had a conversation over the telephone, And
You and the vice president?
and Ron Klain and others. And there were some people who thought that it made sense to try to carry on. Um, I think there were others who thought that the Supreme Court had made pretty clear that they were not going to allow the recount to continue. And remember, it wasn't that they stopped the recount on the 12th. They stopped the recount on the 9th,
right,
before they'd ever heard argument.
Right.
And indeed, if they had not stopped the recount would have been completed by the 12th. And one of the things that I think was frustrating to us was that they stopped the recount on the 9th. It would have been finished by the 12th. But because they stopped it, it wasn't done on the 12th. And then on the 12th, they said, well, it's too late.
Right, because of the safe harbor date. Meanwhile, you could have come into the Supreme Court oral argument and gave them new numbers.
Exactly, and there would have been new numbers. And one of the things that was happening was that as we got reports from the various counties, Gore's deficit was shrinking. And I think everybody thought, both the Republicans and Democrats thought, that if the recount continued, Gore would be ahead. And one of the things that Justice Scalia said when they stopped the recount was, we don't want the recount to continue because maybe Gore is going to be ahead. And then if we invalidate it, people will be really mad at us. And we'll feel that the Bush presidency is not legitimate. Now, that's a strange basis to make a Supreme Court decision, and one that was very frustrating.
Well, Scalia's actual comment, which you're quite right, is interesting given the election we just experienced, and we can talk a little about this more, but Scalia was essentially saying that if we continue this, it will put a cloud over the George W. Bush presidency, and it would cause him irreparable harm. And so he was making an irreparable harm argument, and apparently Justice Stevens in dissent said, where's the irreparable harm from counting every single legal vote?
Right,
Why is that irreparable harm? But I want to come back to this point, because isn't that what President Trump is now saying? Count every single legal vote. So let me just hold that. I just want to, it's the famous last words of Justice Stevens, no doubt has been co-opted by Republican strategists. They're using the exact same words as a liberal Supreme Court justice: count all legal votes. Can we try to take us back? Ed, you're an actor, so you can really take us back. For those of us who it's 20 years, short-term memory problems, people that were too young to know, can we try to remember what it was like in 2000? At that point, everyone in everyone's lifetime, other than the John Kennedy presidency, there had never really been an election in dispute, right? I mean, what was the national mood like with respect to the fact that after Election Day, we still didn't know who the president was, and it took 36 days to find out?
That was very unusual for me as a man who, at age I was, I was 50 years old basically then in the year 2000. And I had no knowledge. I probably should have known what was going on with Nixon in that election, how close it was, and what was going on in Chicago and elsewhere. There was certainly, some malfeasance on the Democrat side, and that race was close. But Nixon conceded in that race. But it wasn't. I never knew of a race being that close in my life, so it was a real nail biter. And I had gone out and campaigned for Al Gore in several states. As a side note, he won in every state that I campaigned for him in. I should have gone to Florida.
Yeah, you should have gone.
I'm kind of kidding. I don't think I would have had any effect, but I would have loved to. Maybe I could have affected 500 some odd people.
Yeah,
wait a second.
All we needed was 500 votes.
That's right.
And I should have. I don't have to go through your IMDb, but you'd be very popular in Florida, Ed. There's a lot of things you've done that everybody remembers seeing you in, so you would have been popular, certainly.
That's right. St. Elsewhere did very well in the Florida market, now that I think of it. So that would time out very well for me around that election and a few other things that I did. But it is what it is, and we soldier on. But I was very disappointed and, really hoping that Al would be president, but that was not to be.
Hey, David, so aside from eating ice cream, until you got that call, what was your feeling about this? First of all, did you think you'd get the call? You are America's leading lawyer. You probably thought someone would give you a call.
No, not really. I was involved in a lot of high-profile cases right then. In fact, they tried to reach me um, for almost 12 hours before they finally reached me because I was um, tied up in other matters. And I knew that the Gore campaign had a lot of really good lawyers working with them. Um, and ultimately, I played a larger role than I thought I would when I went down there. Initially, um, they thought that they had a team to do the trial work, um, and they had a team to handle anything in federal court. And what they were looking for was for me to argue the appellate um, cases in the Florida appellate courts in the Florida Supreme Court. As it worked out, I ended up doing sort of all three of those.
Right.
Trial work and the Florida appellate work and the Supreme Court. But that's not the way it started out.
So was it in some ways for you, I'm wondering, as a leading lawyer who actually among many sources of his reputation were built on the Bush v. Gore, is this the kind of thing that you had bittersweet feelings about? That you don't really think presidential elections should ever be decided in courtrooms? Or did you think actually this is an example of democracy at work?
Well, it's a little of both. I think elections ought to be decided outside the courtroom. I think that it would have been much better if the Supreme Court had simply allowed the canvassing boards to do what they were doing. The canvassing boards, although there have Republicans and Democrats on them, my experience is across the country that they really take their jobs very seriously, and they really do a very thorough and nonpartisan job. And I think that one of the lessons of Bush v. Gore, I think the Supreme Court learned this time around was that the courts really should stay out of the process. Elections ought to be decided by the voters in the voting booth and not by lawyers in courtrooms.
Well, we're going to pick up on what you just talked about because I want to hear some more about what you're thinking the Supreme Court learned a lesson. I'm not sure that we know for sure whether they learned that lesson. So we'll come back to that. Hey, Ed, people complained that the film, I suspect it was the same point that Ted Olson said, but there were criticism that the film had a pro-democratic bias, that it was told from the point of view of Ron Klain, and it had a crusading lawyer named David Boies, played by Ed Begley. And that was really what the movie was about. It was about Klain and Boies riding into, doing everything for victory. And in the end, coming up short, but doing it honorably. Do you think that the film had a pro-democratic bias? There have been some people that think that the portrayal of James Baker was so powerful that this guy was just so, he could outmaneuver anyone, that there would be, an argument to say this was a pro-Republican film.
Baker loved the film.
Right, he did. And for good reason. I think Tom Wilkinson played him very well and quite accurately. And they certainly, and after it was over, I heard some things about the portrayal of Ted Olson, and perhaps that's so. But I think they did a very good job for the most part. And keep in mind, there's some stuff that happened long before the film, the events of the recount took place. Catherine Harris, played wonderfully by Laura Dern, by the way. Yes. They took a lot of voters off the rolls. They, purged a lot of, there's a man named William G. Whiting, who's a minister in Florida. Because there's somebody named William Whiting, Willie G. Whiting was taken off, and he was not allowed to vote, a minister in Florida. And there's cases of thousands of people like that were taken off the rolls. Sadly, mostly African-American people in those districts. And they were, taken off the rolls because they were cherry-picked by Catherine Harris. That's the allegation, and we followed up on that, and there was a fair amount of truth to that. We got a printed copy of an email about doing just that an exchange between Catherine and someone else. I can't remember who, but it was a printout that we showed in close up on the film. So there's some stuff with purging voters from the rolls that was quite incendiary. And so had that not happened, there would have been 500 votes and then some many times over in favor of Al Gore if those people were not purged from the rolls.
It's interesting, David, what Ed just said, because it reminded me of some of these cases that we've seen over the last several weeks. And you'll notice in each of the instances, the courts in dismissing the Trump legal challenges always say the same thing. And when they say this, I always think of what Ed just said, which was, are you asking me to invalidate tens of thousands of votes? And what's implicit in that, in cities like Milwaukee, Detroit, Philadelphia, and Atlanta that have very large African-American populations. Right. And I suspect each time I hear a judge say that, that's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking just what Ed just said, that who wants to be the judge that's going to make a decision that disenfranchises tens of thousands of voters who happen to be African-Americans. So we know the long history of racism and voter suppression with African-Americans in the United States. And I think that has a lot to do with some of these decisions we've been hearing. But I find it interesting that all the judges say the same thing, and they all say it about those four cities.
Mm-hmm. And of course, those are the four cities that the Trump campaign has been trying to do something about.
Right.
I think that there's a reason why the Trump campaign focused on those cities, because they're heavily minority and heavily Democratic. And what they're really asking the courts to do is to invalidate tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of votes, and do it in predominantly minority districts.
Right. Ed, there's something very dramatic about the film it's a small piece, but I think we should, since Ron Klain is a friend of mine, and he's also been a guest at Falk several times, the movie has that one scene that most people miss, which is that Ron Klain had been demoted in the campaign. So I don't know if he was campaign chairman or manager, but he was demoted. And then he gets this new gig, which is to lead the legal team, right? And that's his strategy. He's the one that brings in David Boies, right? He's the one and so that's the part. Oh, by the way, I forgot to say, there is one other person who wasn't happy with the portrayal. It was Ron Klain, because he said that Kevin Spacey was at least 20 years older, at least 20 years older than, he was a boy in 2000, but he said, I can't believe that I was played by a man that age. But there is a redemptive side, because for those of you who have been paying attention, Ron Klain, who is portrayed in the film as Spacey, is now been appointed Joe Biden's chief of staff.
Yes.
So, and wisely so. I think he's a very capable man. So that made me feel very confident about Joe Biden's choices, because I think Ron Klain is going to do a wonderful job.
Yeah, I just think it's an incredibly it has a very redemptive, dramatic arc, right?
He now has Jim Baker's job.
Exactly.
Right.
He now has Jim Baker's job. The guy
Wasn't Tom Wilkinson wonderful? And I talked about Laura Dern, who was spectacular in my opinion, but I loved Tom Wilkinson too, playing James Baker. He just did a terrific job. This guy from England, they do these accents so well. He's just a wonderful actor.
Yeah. I wondered actually, Ed, whether you knew because we almost had Jay Roach, the director, was going to be with us, but he's got a film he's shooting. But I was going to ask, because of Wilkinson playing James Baker, that they didn't think they needed to have a fully fleshed out Ted Olson to compete against David Boies. It just seemed weird to me. That, I'm a big David Boies fan, of course, so I love the attention he got on the movie. But his adversary really comes across as the strategist, Baker, and not really a legal adversary in the courtroom. Do we know anything about that?
I'm not sure how that happened. I wasn't privy to any of that, and I wasn't there when they shot all the Ted Olson stuff, so I didn't hear anything about it till I heard some complaints that it was not accurate, but they got it mostly right in that film, I believe.
So, David, maybe you can help us with this. I think it is still confusing, the difference between dimpled what is it? Was dimpled chads, pregnant chads, or I think in the movie they said that the plural for chads is chad. But I don't understand the relationship between the votes that you can't determine, as you argued in the Supreme Court. The standard should be voter intent, right? Now, you'll explain that to the audience in a moment, that that's the legal standard that you think is important. But I don't understand how that relates to the Pat Buchanan votes, because the Pat Buchanan votes is a very different idea. That's not about hanging chads, dimpled chads, pregnant chads. That's about, frankly, a number of Jewish retirees, many of them who live in South Florida. I love them dearly. I'm from South Florida. I know, I get the concept. They're excellent at playing bingo, but this they were not so good at. In doing their vote, they accidentally, apparently, voted for Pat Buchanan. I don't understand how that happened. So that's something else. That sounds more like what Donald Trump is saying now, which is that we need to remove those votes, because there's thousands of votes that went for Buchanan that should have gone for Gore, and we have to somehow disqualify Buchanan votes. That is a very different point, I think, than the Chad issue. Am I right?
Well, it is a very different point. The Buchanan point was in Palm Beach County. They had a very confusing ballot where
the butterfly ballot, right?
So-called butterfly ballot, exactly right. And because of the way it was put together, it was quite unclear whether, if you punched for what you thought was Gore, you were really punching for Buchanan. And lots of people made that mistake. The problem is that once they voted, there's no way to figure out which of those votes were a mistake. There's no way you can go back and pull those votes out. So they're really...
but why is that? Because this has a lot to do with what Donald Trump is trying to do now. Why is that? Because they get commingled? And
yes, they're all commingled. The whole point of secret ballot is that once you voted, nobody can find your ballot.
I see.
So if I said I voted for Gore, there's no way to go back and check whether my ballot was for Gore or for Buchanan.
Because the Jews of Palm Beach County are literally saying, if it has a Jewish last name, you know for sure they weren't voting for Pat Buchanan, and for sure they were voting for Al Gore.
And everybody knew that there were thousands of votes that were a mistake. The problem is you couldn't prove which votes could be changed, and in a presidential election you can't have a duel because everybody's got to vote on the same day.
So the manual recount did not refer to the Buchanan issue.
No, the manual recount has nothing to do with it. Entirely separate issue. I mean, there were about 4 or 5 things that had to go wrong for Al Gore to lose.
Right.
You had to have the butterfly ballot. You had to have Ralph Nader siphon off many times more votes. You had to have the purging of the votes that took off thousands of Democratic votes.
Which is the point that Ed made before, right? That point.
That Ed was making before.
Right.
You had voter intimidation and harassment on election day, particularly in northern Florida, where there were roadblocks set up in minority districts that diverted people and kept them from going to the polls. The Supreme Court's intervention and the Supreme Court stopping of the vote count is what everybody remembers. But there were a whole series of things that went wrong in that election and that led to Al Gore not being inaugurated president.
And then the film captures the scene very dramatically of what was happening in the recount of Miami.
Yes.
When his Hispanic Cubans actually stormed the room. And so the idea was the idea there was find ways to stop the count no matter how we count. And if you frighten people to not count, they won't count.
And it was a total breakdown in the rule of law. because you had a Republican governor, Republican Secretary of State, nobody enforced the law. One of the things that the governor in Pennsylvania did when people began to protest and try to stop the vote count there is he said, we're not going to allow that to happen. We'll bring in whatever law enforcement is necessary to protect the people. And that's what should have happened in Florida. And again, if that had happened, Al Gore would have been inaugurated president.
So, Ed, when people say, you know, this case, the election itself and the lawsuit that went to the Supreme Court is more political than legal, and you hear what, you know, David just said about a breakdown in the rule of law, I mean, do you agree with that, that in the eyes of people watching this 20 years ago, that although there were high-powered lawyers like David Boies there was also a sense that what was happening was, look, there's a Republican governor who happens to be the younger brother of one of the candidates. There's a Secretary of State who's seemingly will do what anything, as long as she gets to get her makeup right, because that was captured on film a lot. You know, it does lead to kind of cynicism about the electoral process.
It does. It was an unfortunate chain of events. Al Gore died the death of 1,000 cuts. You had the roadblocks and other vote intimidation. You had purging from the rolls. You had the butterfly ballot. You had all sorts of things going wrong. Ralph Nader on the ticket. All those things, each one of them individually are probably many more times than 500 votes. And
right.
And so it's a, you know, it's an unfortunate thing that happened in 2000. And so now we press on, and hopefully things will go smoothly between now and the inauguration in January. I'm hoping there's no problems with this election.
Well, let's talk about that for a moment. President Trump was very clear several months ago that he wanted to make sure there would be a 9th justice on the Supreme Court. He was very clear. He told us why. That's what I love about this. He's really honest about it. He said,
very much so.
Yeah, he said, I have a feeling that this is going to be a problem, and I would like to make sure that I have friends on the Supreme Court the next time David Boies shows up. You know, I mean, I just find it so stunning that he was very honest about what he thought he was doing.
He's honest about a lot of stuff. The whole Comey thing, it's Comey in Russia. I had to get rid of him.
Yeah, exactly.
The whole, you know, almost
he tells
lost his IFB out of his ear when that happened.
Yeah, it's part of his charm. He tells you exactly what he's thinking.
Exactly.
So the question here for both of you, but David in particular, you know, it does, when a president says that, it even reinforces again that what is the rule of law? You know, what is the Constitution? I remember there's a very famous line that was attributed to either one of your girlfriends or wives. David, I remember this. It was on 60 Minutes. You're not going to believe I remember this.
Yeah.
They said, what do you think about your husband, or, you know, who just won the most important First Amendment lawsuit in the history of this nation? I guess that was the 60 Minutes Westmoreland case. Right. And that woman said, whoever she was in your life at the time, she said, your wife, she had that great line. She says, can you believe I remember this? She said, well, it's a short amendment. It's a great line. So I want to get to the question that your wife raised, which is, it does make you think like we don't know what the law is, that it's a short amendment. It doesn't tell you, it doesn't give you enough information so that it allows for things like Bush v. Gore. It allows for this sort of openly politicized election that looked like we were putting another conservative justice on the Supreme Court just in case.
Right. I think that's true, and I think that was one of the most troubling parts about Bush v. Gore. The Supreme Court's made mistakes before. Plessy against Ferguson that upheld segregation, the Dred Scott case that upheld slavery, the Japanese internment case that upheld the internment of Japanese citizens who had committed no crime during the Second World War. But this was a case that in some senses was even worse in that it was not a case responding to political pressures at the time. It was a case that attempted to intervene in a partisan election. attempted to put its thumb on the scale of electing a president of the United States. And the Supreme Court as such had never done that before and has never done that since. And I hope, and I really expect we'll never do it again. Because when the court does that, it breaks down the trust that is really the center of the court's power. Court has power because we respect its decisions. It doesn't have the power of the purse. It doesn't have a control over the Army or the National Guard. Its rulings are enforced and accepted because we respect it as an institution. And I think there are justices on the court, both Republican and Democrat today, who believe in the integrity of the court, believe in the court as an institution. And they are going to protect, I think, the court's reputation in that respect. And I think you saw that in this election. They had a number of times that people came to them asking them to intervene, again, to stop electoral counts, to disqualify ballots. And each time the court declined to do so.
Well, do you think that the remaining pieces of Pennsylvania cases, they simply will not hear?
Oh, this election is over with. This election's been over with for 2 or 3 weeks.
So there are no way do you expect to get a call that says, we're going back to the Supreme Court? Because remember, I have a few thoughts about this. One was that, remember, it was Justice Alito that several times told Pennsylvania, make sure that you segregate the ballots, separate the mail-in ballots from, it made people who watch the Supreme Court, like I do, think, well, why is he doing that unless he's really concerned that he might actually have to review this? Justice Kavanaugh, in that Wisconsin emergency appeal from a month ago, invoked Bush v. Gore, which is very interesting because you'll remember, you more than anyone remember, Bush v. Gore literally said this is a limit. It said this is a one-shot deal. One shot.
Like the Muhammad Ali decision, right?
Yeah, this thing will explode after you hear the recording.
Right, exactly. Good for this ride only.
This ride only. It's good. This ticket will never happen again. And so there are people for 20 years that said, well, thank goodness Bush v. Gore will not be precedent in any case, until Justice Kavanaugh 5-6 weeks ago invoked I think it was at that time, to stop Wisconsin from extending their deadline for voting in the same way that was happening in Pennsylvania and Georgia and in Nevada. So I'm curious to hear from you. To you, you would be utterly shocked if the Supreme Court decided to take any of these up.
I would be. I would be very, very surprised. I mean, for one thing, I do think that there's a majority on the court, and it's not just Democrats, it's Republicans and Democrats who respect the rule of law and who are not going to want to have the court again intervene to be seen as trying to put their thumb on the scale of a presidential election. For another thing, this election is not close. It's close in percentage terms in some key states, but 10,000 votes is an enormous difference from 500 votes.
Yeah, but David, let me push back just slightly here. So you represented 20 years ago the team that said, count all legal votes. Mm-hmm. There's no reason to stop counting. This president and their legal team is saying, well, you overcounted votes that were illegal. And in some cases, it was tens of thousands of them. You made, because of the pandemic. I'm just curious, I don't know whether you were contacted by the Trump team to join their legal team. No. I'm just saying their argument, if you don't want to use the word widespread fraud, I think that's a huge mistake. I just think if they simply said the following, right? Because of the pandemic, we opened the floodgates on mail-in ballots in a way that we were unprepared for. And because of that, various different state election officials and courts created new rules to extend the deadline, to change the verification procedure, various changes that were done to the election rules. So at its core, that is still a constitutional argument. Why? Because Article 2 of the Constitution says that state election laws can only be created for federal elections by state legislatures. It can't be created by courts, and it can't. And this is why I was wondering, I thought this is what Alito was interested in. He was interested in the constitutional argument. These state election boards and the courts did not have the constitutional authority to extend the deadlines and do away with certain rules for verification or application processes. I'm just curious that in a more sober time, when we're not dealing with Trump, issues, which just has overwhelmed us, but just as a law school class, is there nothing there? That argument means nothing to David Boies?
There's very little there. And one of the reasons there's very little there is one of the things that Bush v. Gore got right is that part of state law is the courts interpreting state law. You'll recall that the Bush campaign argued this very thing to the Supreme Court in 2000. They argued that the Supreme Court of Florida, by ordering a statewide recount, had imposed a rule and only the legislature could.
Exactly.
But they only got 3 votes for that.
Yeah.
6 votes were against them.
What did you argue in the Supreme Court in response to that?
And Justice Kennedy said this from the bench, that one of the things that courts do all the time is interpret state laws. The legislature passes the state law, but somebody's got to interpret those laws.
So that's different from rewriting the law.
They're not rewriting the law, they're interpreting the law.
Right.
And they're interpreting legislative intent. And state courts do that all the time. Even with respect to the so-called extending of deadlines, courts do that in virtually every time there's a 4-year election. Courts do that in some respect. And for example, the Trump campaign went into Clark County, Nevada in this election and said to the court, extend the deadline. Keep the polls open.
That did happen.
And courts do that all the time because they conclude that part of the legislative enactment is to try to make the election fair and open. And so if a voting machine breaks down, if there are long lines, if there's a flood or a fire, courts extend deadlines all the time. So the courts doing it here were not particularly unusual. And the third thing is that for it to go to the Supreme Court, there's got to be a federal constitutional issue. And ordinarily, the federal courts always let state courts interpret state law. And that's what was happening in Florida in 2000. It's what's happened in Pennsylvania this time. And this time, I think the Supreme Court got it right.
Ed, if this movie had come out, let's say, this summer during the pandemic when everybody was thirsting for content, and this is why all of our folks events are so heavily attended. If this movie come out with such a star-studded cast right before a presidential election, do you think that this movie with its perhaps Democratic bias might have actually helped the Trump campaign?
I don't think so.
And the reason I'm asking is because it would have been, this is what happens in elections. You have legal disputes, and oftentimes the disputes are to either count votes or not count votes. Today, you hear a lot of, look, the election is over, this is just a delay tactic, this is an abuse of power, right? All the things that are said about this attempt by Donald Trump to reclaim another 4 years, to say that the election was stolen. I'm wondering whether people would have been more, I doubt it, more blue state people would be more sympathetic if this movie had come out in that time.
I don't think so, because I think they got nearly everything right. Maybe had the wrong emphasis on the few things of, a few people represented in the film, but I think they got the basic facts right. And David just said it perfectly. State courts rule on these kinds of things and interpret this all the time. As he said, flood and other sorts of problems that have happened long before COVID. And COVID was an unusual turn of events. They were right to interpret things what was intended by the laws of the state. For people to extend it, I think was within the boundaries of the law. And I think the state courts got it right. And I don't think there's any real case for it. I don't think it would have swayed a lot of people to being sympathetic to Trump, but who knows? People find ways to believe what I think is one of the most amazing con men of all time. So I think people are going to find some reason to side with him no matter what, even in the face of reason.
So, David,
and remember, Trump got his recount. Trump got his statewide
right
in Georgia, for example.
That's correct. He did get his recounts.
He asked for it, and he got it.
Yeah, but you know, he would say that doesn't count. And I'll tell you why he would say that. He would say, I'm asking you not to recount the votes that were already counted. I'm telling you it's the votes that are sitting there to be tabulated. That's the problem. If you keep recounting, I will lose every time. But what I'm asking you to do, this is what's so unprecedented about what he's saying. What I'm asking you to do is to literally disqualify tens of thousands, if not. That's different between just a pure recount, right? Which is what we had in Florida.
But that's exactly why the movie wouldn't help him.
Good point.
Because what he's asking to do is something that nobody was asking in 2000, which is actually to throw the votes away.
Right.
We wanted to count, finish the count. The Republicans wanted to stop the count, but nobody was saying throw the ballots away.
Yeah, nobody even said throw the butterfly ballots away.
Exactly.
Good point. Good point. Right. Well, it's the ultimate in disenfranchisement and suppression when you literally, which is why I'm saying the judges all seems to have that same reaction we've seen over the last month. Are you they're literally saying, are you out of your mind? Do you think I live in this town? Do you think I'm going to disqualify hundreds, thousands of votes? I'm not doing that.
Right.
David, explain this just because it is important, and it's important to understand the Supreme Court decision of Bush v. Gore. So they vote 7-2 on equal protection grounds to stop the recount. And the reason they say is because the state of Florida doesn't have a uniform system for recounting, so that a ballot in Miami that could go to Gore could actually go to Bush if it was in Tallahassee or something. So that they're saying because of the disparate treatment between precincts, counties, even voting machines, that is an equal protection. And 7 justices bought that argument, right? But one of the things that I'm interested in,
not actually correct.
Am I not correct?
Not correct.
Okay, good. Explain that.
For example, the 7 justices that you're talking about would include Justice Breyer.
Right.
And Justice Breyer in his dissent says explicitly, the court should never have taken the case and should never stop the recount. There were not 7 judges saying to stop the recount. In fact, the vote to stop the recount was 5-4.
Right.
Now, what Justice Breyer and one of the other judges in the minority did say was that there were equal protection issues because of what you're saying. That is the different approaches to determining the voter intent. But one of the things that Justice Breyer pointed out in his dissent is that those differences were less than the differences that came because Florida had 4 different kinds of voting machines.
Right.
And Justice Breyer pointed out in his dissent that the likelihood of having your vote counted that was changed by the different voter intent approaches was less than the effect on having your vote counted depending on the machine that you're counting. And if there was an equal protection issue on the one, there had to be an equal protection issue on the other. And if you threw out all of those votes, then Gore would have won again.
I see. So explain to me, 20 years goes by, and I understand Bush v. Gore is a one-shot deal, limited circumstance to this one case. But I do think that we're hearing very similar arguments today in some of the states that have different standards for tabulations within the states themselves. In other words, did we not learn something from Bush v. Gore that there is an equal protection argument to be made if the precincts are not counting in the same way and the procedures are not in the same way and different rules are applying within the state? It just seems to me it opened up the door. It just opens up the door. If President Trump's legal team could get before the Supreme Court, they would say the same thing. They'd say, look, remember what happened 20 years ago? You said there's an equal protection argument. How come it doesn't apply now?
Well, but the reason it doesn't apply now is that the voting machines have changed. You don't. The reason that you had the voting intent problem was that the punch card machines were, infamously known not to count various votes, and now with the optical character recognition machines, or even the touch screen that have the paper trail, there is a clear record of what the voter intent is. And if a OCR ballot is not counted, you can then look at where the marks are. But those are very, very far and few between. That's why the hand recount was done in Georgia, basically did not change any votes. The vote count changed by a few hundred because they found some ballots that had not been counted. But it was not a different standard precinct by precinct.
Let's take some questions from the audience and we'll say goodnight soon. This comes from an anonymous attendee who says, and Ed, why don't you start with this? What do you think will be the aftermath of this election? How will we move on from this situation? Do you have an opinion as somebody who is politically minded? We know this about you, socially justice minded, civics minded, and an actor who starred as David Boies in a movie called Recount. I mean, it did seem like after Recount that, of course, 9/11 happened a year later, and then all of a sudden the world changed and nobody was thinking about Bush v. Gore. I wonder whether people would have spent more time thinking about Bush v. Gore had there not been a 9/11 and wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Just a question for folks' audience to think about. But I am curious to know, most people aren't thinking about the legacy of Bush v. Gore. This question really is talking about what is the aftermath of this when, in fact, this election, was bruising in its own respects.
I think absent someone that is so decisive at the top, we can begin to move forward and realize that we need each other, and we really do, and begin to come together and begin to heal. I think that's important. It's not going to happen overnight, but if you achieve a critical mass of people that realize that how much we need each other, people in the Midwest need people in the coast and vice versa, and we can begin to move on. I think that's essential, and I'm hoping that I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure that happened.
Love that answer. Thank you, Ed. This person, I think David wants free legal advice, but here you go. Ready? Is there some hypothetical scenario in which Trump could win? What would that look like? You've already discounted some of the things that I raised.
Yeah.
But would you be afraid to give us the winning legal argument in case Rudy Giuliani was watching?
Yeah. The problem is there just isn't a winning legal argument. I mean, there's sometimes when the game's over, and you may be happy with it or unhappy with it. But the thing is, there just is not a plausible, possible legal case here. There are too many things that would have to be changed. You'd have to change too many states. This is not like Florida, where if you just can change one state, you can win the election. You'd have to change multiple states. There are states where the votes have been counted and recounted. So you don't have the recount argument that we were making. There's no way to go back and take out mail-in ballots, even if you wanted to. And you've got to remember that although we used a lot more mail-in ballots this year than usual, many Republican states, like Florida, have used mail-in ballots for many years. So the idea that now all of a sudden there's something wrong with mail-in ballots is is hard to understand and impossible to make a legal case out of. So
Hey, Ed, I know you said that you had met David before you started, I guess, shooting principal photography, but you were arguing in front of a fictitious Supreme Court of the United States, and we saw you arguing before a fictitious Supreme Court of Florida. You did very nicely.
Yeah.
Did you actually call David Boies while this was going on and said, "Here are my lines"? I'm curious, what kind of research did you do, since David Boies was one phone call away?
I would never bother such an esteemed lawyer with such minutia. I mean, he's got real things to do, not worry about it. But hopefully I got it close enough to, got the tone of what he was trying to do. But the words speak for themselves. He was quite eloquent there on that day, many other days, as he stood before the Supreme Court and in other courts and other important venues. So I just tried to, bring forth his gravitas and the weight that he brought to it and the brilliant scholarly mind.
And Ed, I think that's a good point. I'm glad you raised it, because I believe I read that when it came to the screenplay, when it came to the arguments before the courts, they were verbatim from the transcript. So
that's my understanding, and so David can tell us if we got it right or wrong.
You got the lines right, and you delivered them better than I did.
Not possible. You're a very kind man, we now all know.
Yeah, but Ed, let me just tell you, I know that David Boies is very happy that you had that role.
Yes.
Vice versa.
Last question. What's that? Sorry, say that again.
It was a great honor for me.
Well, it was such a lovely honor to have you both here tonight. Before we say goodnight, there's one last question from the audience that I'll take. This person wants to know, David, whether you would ever consider, or had you considered, writing a book about the legal battle in Bush v. Gore. This person says that none of the principal players wrote a book that they thought from their perspective. I believe that Jake Tapper from CNN wrote a book that might have even been used as a consultant for the movie, but none of the lawyers did. Is this something that might be interesting to you? You've had such a varied legal career. Would you zero in on this case over others?
Well, I did. I actually did write a book.
About this?
I wrote a book about the 4 years of my practice from 1997 through 2001.
And it included this, ended on this.
It had 3 chapters on this, a book called Courting Justice. And it dealt with about a dozen cases that I did during that period, including the U.S. against Microsoft case, and an environmental case against W.R. Grace, parental kidnapping case, New York Yankees against Major League Baseball, and of course, Bush v. Gore.
Yeah, my memory of some of that is Bill Gates will never forget that case. He'll never forget sitting beside you on the opposite side of you. That's what I remember. So the person who asked that question, here's something you can do. Go on Amazon and buy David's book, because he'll answer those questions. Before we say goodnight to Ed and David, I want to extend everybody happy holidays. This has been a really rough 10 months, very challenging. As you know, at Folks, we went virtual starting in around May. I think this is our 20th or more program that we've produced. And so we're happy to be here with you during this pandemic and providing content that's interesting and smart and entertaining, hopefully, with really, really smart guests like Ed and David. But, we should maybe all look forward to a day that we can all be on stage together. Ed, David, I would like to, at the end of this, I would have loved to given you a hug instead of just a good night. So let's all have something to look forward to do something like this in the future. Again, we're a nonprofit. We haven't charged in the last 10 months. You can always donate by folks.org/donate. Of course, that gives you the text button. It's a tax deductible contribution, and you might have a year-end reason to do one. On behalf of Folks, I want to say again, thank you both, Ed and David, for a wonderfully smart, entertaining, collegial evening, and really brought the movie and the story alive for us at a time that could not be more timely. So thank you both, Ed, David, Thane Rosenbaum. See you next time from Folks. Check us out on folks.org, and we'll see you in the next year with our new programs. Thank you all.
Thank you. Take care. Be safe.
Thank you, Thane.
Bye, Ed. Bye, David.